My name is Sarong Kim, and in my time, I will present 5 objective inquiries. The first question requires, discuss the role that the Stamp Act played in the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies from 1765 to 1772. The role that the Stamp Act played in the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies from 1765 to 1772 is that it tethered the fragile relationship the colonies once shared with their mother country. This is a product of the newly emerging idea of taxation without representation and the belief that it is the people who hold the final say in government and thus should be entitled to the fundamental rights such as life, liberty, and property. Continuing on, to reiterate the first proposed product of the passing of the Stamp Act, it led to the emergence of the idea of taxation without representation, or otherwise that it was morally unjust for the colonies to be taxed without representation in government. In the historical document of October 19, 1765, the resolution of the Continental Congress in response to the Stamp Act, it was written that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of the people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. This text reflected widespread patriotic sentiments at the time of the aforementioned piece of legislation, that in order to be free, people must have a say in how they are taxed. This voice can be given by way of consent to governance under the election of representatives who would be intended to speak in government on behalf of the people. The Virginia Resolves on the Stamp Act by Patrick Henry also supplied that the taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them who can only know what taxes the people are able to bear and the easiest mode of raising them and are equally affected by such taxes themselves is a distinguishing characteristic of British freedom and without which the ancient constitution cannot subsist. This text delegates the right of taxation to the people or the officials they elect to represent themselves in government rather than a foreign external body. Moving on, the Stamp Act impacted the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies in the way that it led to the emergence of the belief that it is the people that hold the final authority in government, and thus should be inherently entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and property. It is argued that because it is the role of the government to protect the people's fundamental rights, it is utterly absurd that they should have to resign these liberties upon joining a government. In the document November 20th, 1772, The Rights of the Colonists, Samuel Adams. It specifically states that, in short, it is the greatest absurdity to suppose in the power of one or any number of men at the entering into society to renounce their essential natural rights or the means of preserving those rights, when the great end of civil government from the very nature of its institution is for the support, protection, and defiance of those very rights, the principle of which as is before observed, are life, liberty, and property. If men through fear, fraud, or mistake should in terms renounce and give up any essential natural right, the eternal law of reason and the great end of society would absolutely vacate such renunciation. The right to freedom being the gift of God Almighty, is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave, which affirms the idea that the government is intended to serve the people rather than force them into servitude. It denotes the unfair power being exerted on the colonies and additionally attempts to shift the balance of this dynamic. Thus, the Stamp Act played a role in the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies in that it tethered the previous cautious stability in an unprecedented manner. Through its passage emerged the essential belief that the colonies should not be taxed without the representation in government, and that it is the people who hold the final say in government, and thus should be inherently entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and property.
Thank you, Sarong Kim. Next, we will move on to the second question, being discuss how the colonies, and in particular, the Committee of Correspondence, responded to the Tea Act Resolution of 1773. The colonies and in particular the Committee of Correspondence, responded to the Tea Act resolution of 1773 with a more fortified sense of resistance. This was a product of the widespread sentiment that the British taxation of colonies without representing them in government, otherwise dubbed taxation without representation, was wrongful, as well as the newfound belief that the colonists must defend themselves against Great Britain's attempts to levy taxes, and that if no such defense was made, there would be dire consequences. To develop a full understanding as to why the colonists were wont to loathe the Tea Act to such a high degree, it is important to have a fair comprehension of its contents. Passed by the British Parliament, the Tea Act resolution was set forth to refund custom taxes that were placed on tea exported to the American colonies, while still maintaining the existing tax that had been imposed on the product. Its main intention was to help the financially troubled East India Tea Company, which was the main handler of this good, to bypass middlemen, or colonial merchants who generally sold tea and sell the item directly to the colonies. This vexed the colonists, who saw it as a deceitful attempt to coerce them into coming to terms with the previously instated tax, and also as taxation without representation. A tax placed without their consent, as they received no governmental representation. As the facts of the instance have already been laid down, we will now begin with an explanation of the colonists' response to the Tea Act, to which it is evident that the colonies responded to the Tea Act resolution of 1773 with a more fortified sense of resistance, as a product of the widespread belief that the taxation imposed on them by the British without representing them in government, otherwise dubbed taxation without representation, was wrongful. In the Philadelphia resolutions in response to the Tea Act 1773, it is stated that the disposal of their own property is the inherent right of freemen, that there can be no property and that which another can, of right, take from us without our consent, that the claim of Parliament to tax America is, in other words, a claim of right to levy contributions on us at pleasure, that the duty imposed by Parliament upon tea landed in America is a tax on the Americans, or levying contributions on them without their consent. In essence, this means that it is the fundamental right of all people to have a sense of autonomy over their possessions. Thus, Great Britain's taxing of the colonists without their consent, or, for that matter, any form of representation in government, was viewed as an encroachment on their inherent rights. Continuing on, the fortified resistance of the colonists to the attempts of taxation by the British was a product of the belief that they needed to defend themselves against such efforts. In the Philadelphia Resolutions on Taxation and Liberty, published on October 16, 1773, it is stated that a virtuous and steady opposition to this ministerial plan of governing of America is necessary to preserve even the shadow of liberty, and is a duty of which every freeman in America owes to his country, to himself, and to his posterity. That is the duty of every American to oppose this attempt. This statement was a general reflection of the patriot stance of the time, being that to preserve their freedom, it was the imperative duty of the colonists to maintain unified resistance against the acts they deemed as markedly oppressive. Moreover, the colonists believed that if no defense against the British government was made, there would be dire consequences. The Boston Tea Party, an act managed in part by the Committee of Correspondence, is an example of a measure taken by the colonists to defend themselves against the tyranny of the British government. The document Tea Destroyed by Indians, 1773, states, "How grand the scene, no tyrant shall oppose. The tea is sunk in spite of all of our foes. A noble sight to see the accursed tea mingled with mud, and forever to be. For king and prince shall know that we are free," expressing the patriots, encompassing the Committee of Correspondence, feelings of triumph at having destroyed the tea despite their opposition. In the document Diary of John Adams after the Boston Tea Party, John Adams, when reflecting upon whether the action was necessary, recorded in his diary that it was absolutely and indispensably so. To let it be landed would be giving up the principle of taxation by parliamentary authority, against which the continent has been struggling against for 10 years. It was losing all of our labor for 10 years in subjecting ourselves and our posterity forever to Egyptian taskmakers. to burdens, indignities, to ignominy, reproach, and contempt, to desolation and oppression, to poverty and servitude. This, in essence, means that in allowing the tea to land, the colonists believed that they would have surrendered to be mistreated under the king's unlawful rulership, which furthermore affirms the claim that the colonists believed that if they made no measures to defend themselves against the British government, they would face dire consequences. Thus, the colonies, and in particular the Committee of Correspondence, responded to the Tea Act resolution of 1773 with a more consolidated sense of resistance. This sentiment was a product of the widespread belief of the colonists that they were being taxed without their consent or otherwise representation in the British government, and that the colonists must defend against the British's attempts to levy taxes on them, lest they face dire consequences. I will now pass the floor to my co-counsel, EbdonKim, who addressed the third inquiry.
Next, discuss how the colonies responded to the intolerable acts of 1774, specifically the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Quartering Act. The colonies responded to the intolerable acts of 1774, specifically the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Quartering Act, by boycotting many British goods and partaking in disobedience against the British Parliament, as well as asserting that the Crown holds no rights, privileges, or authority over the colonies. In short, after the colonists were forced into bearing the continuous taxations and regulations placed on them, the intolerable acts served as a final straw that broke the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies. Firstly, to address the Boston Port Act, the British Parliament deemed that it would be sufficient to completely immobilize the Boston port until the cost of tea discarded during the Boston Tea Party was covered. This was extremely detrimental to the colonists because their main economic activity was now banned. In the circular letter of the Boston Committee of Correspondence on May 13, 1774, the Committee of Correspondence responded to the act at hand with the statement, "The single question then is, whether you consider Boston as now suffering in the common cause, and sensibly feel and resent the injury and affront offered to here if you do, may we not rely on your suspending your trade with Great Britain at least, which it is acknowledged will be great but necessary sacrifice to the cause of liberty and will effectually defeat the design of this act of revenge. This declares that the colonies will boycott Great Britain in defiance to the Boston Port Act." Second, the Massachusetts Government Act enforced royal power and limited colonial self-governance. Consequently, the town meetings were restricted and councils were replaced and chosen by the British Parliament. The Massachusetts Government Act on May 20th, 1774 directly states, the governor for the time being, or in his absence, the lieutenant governor, without the consent of the control, shall have full power and authority to nominate and appoint the persons to succeed to the said offices, who shall hold their commissions during the pleasure of His Majesty, his heirs and successors, and that neither the Chief Justice or judges appointed before the said first day of July 1774, nor those who shall hereafter be appointed pursuant to this act shall be removed, unless by the order of His Majesty, his heirs or successors, under his or their signed manual. As can be seen in this quote, His Majesty revoked the Electoral College for the sole benefit of his own power. The colonists responded to the act with civil disobedience through the failure to pay taxes, as can be seen in Suffolk Resolves on September 9th, 1774. That it be recommended to the collectors of taxes, constables, and all other officers who have the public's money in their hands, to retain the same, and do not make any payment thereof to the province or country treasurers, until the civil government of the province is placed upon a constitutional foundation, or until it shall otherwise be ordered by the proposed provincial congress. Third, the Quartering Act allowed soldiers to rest in private homes and required the homeowners to provide space for them. The Quartering Act on June 2nd, 1774 specified that, in such cases, it shall be lawful for the persons who now are, or may be hereafter, authorized by law in any of the provinces within His Majesty's dominions in North America, and are hereby respectively authorized, empowered, and directed on the requisition of the officer who, for the time being, has the command of His Majesty's forces in North America, to cause any officers or soldiers in His Majesty's service to be quartered and billeted in such manner as now directed by law, where no barracks are provided by the colonies. The Intolerable Acts in their entirety pushed Britain and pushed the colonists to further become convinced that they had no further reason to obey Great Britain. The colonists resolved that as we acknowledge in the existence and control of no law or legal officer, civil or military, within this county, we do hereby ordain and adopt as a rule of life all, each, and every one of our former laws, wherein, nevertheless, the Crown of Great Britain will never can be considered as holding rights, privileges, or authorities therein. In conclusion, the colonies responded to the Intolerable Acts of 1774, specifically the Boston Poor Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Quartering Act, by boycotting British goods and partaking in acts of disobedience against the British Parliament, alongside asserting that the Crown holds no rights, privileges, or authority in the colonies. After being forced to bear continuous restrictions, regulations, and taxations, the Intolerable Acts were the final straw that convinced the colonies to declare independence.
Moving on to the fourth inquiry, I will now discuss how the actions of the Continental Congress in 1774 moved the colonies towards declaring independence. The actions of the Continental Congress in 1774 moved the colonies towards ultimately declaring independence in 1776. This is demonstrated through their various contributions to the patriotic cause, in which they unified the mutual resistance shared by numerous colonists and organized various systems, such as colonial militias, in favor of seeking independence from Great Britain. To begin, the colonies unified the mutual resistance shared by numerous colonists. While many colonists expressed some forms of grievances in regards to their mistreatment under British rule, it was the Continental Congress that gathered these beliefs and formed them into one. In the document Motion on Non-Exportation in Defense, 30th of September 1774, penned by the Continental Congress, it is stated that the province of the Massachusetts Bay and the town of Boston are now suffering and struggling in the common cause of American freedom, and therefore it is the indispensable duties of all colonies to support them by every necessary means, and to the last extremity. In essence, this means it underlined how imperative it was for the colonies to support all of their neighbors and appealed for unification. If an act of aggression was made against one colony, then, under this principle, it applied to the next. This unified resistance was the very foundation of the American Republic and solidified them as a single body, stronger in unity than in isolation. This idea is also present in December 1774, Novanglis, John Adams, and Massachusetts Senator Daniel Leonard, where it is declared that the Congress of Philadelphia, having expressed the same sentiments with the people of New England, approved of the opposition to the late innovations unanimously advised by to persevere in it, and assured us that if force is attempted to carry these measures against us, all of America ought to support us, which furthermore demonstrates that the Continental Congress's efforts in unifying the colonies resulted in a high degree of benefit being supplied on the colonies. Continuing on, born from the Continental Congress were various organized systems such as colonial militias in favor of seeking independence from Great Britain. The document December 1774, Novanglis, John Adams, and Massachusetts Senator Daniel Leonard, when addressing the feelings of the American colonies toward their mother country, Great Britain, declared that Maryland and the lower counties on Delaware have already to show all of the world their approbation of the measures of New England and their determination to join in them with a generosity, a wisdom, and magnanimity which ought to make the Tories consider taking the power of the militia into the hands of the people without the governor or minister, and established it by their own authority for the defense of Massachusetts as well as themselves, Other colonies are only waiting to see if the necessity of it will become more obvious. Virginia and the Carolinas are preparing for military defense and have been for some time. This text expressly endorsed in feeling the efforts of Maryland and Delaware in seizing control of a militia and establishing their own authority. It also serves to demonstrate that various militias had already been assembled or could be begot with a moment's notice, likely a product of the Continental Congress's efforts in unifying the colonial resistance against Great Britain. Hence, the actions of the Continental Congress in 1774 were effective in that they moved the colonies towards declaring independence in many regards. They unified the mutual resistance and feelings of dislike expressed by the colonists towards Great Britain and begot various organized systems such as colonial militias with the intent to become independent from Great Britain. I will now pass the floor to my co-counsel, Sarang Kim, who will discuss the fifth inquiry.
Regarding the fifth inquiry states, describe the arguments advanced by the patriots in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings from 1774 to 1776 that supported declaring independence. Throughout the years of 1774 to 1776, several arguments were advanced by patriots in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings from 1774 to 1776 that supported declaring independence. Among them were beliefs that the colonists' rights were being abridged by the way of taxation without representation, or otherwise the levying of taxes from the colonists without representation in government, and that a distant government such as Great Britain was unfit to rule the colonies. To begin, the arguments advanced by patriots in favor of declaring independence argue that the fundamental rights of the colonists were being abridged as a result of the taxes being levied from them without their consent, or otherwise representation in government. Taxing them for the purpose of federal revenue, the patriots argued, as opposed to mutual benefit, was akin to forcing them into servitude. In the document October 14, 1774, Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, it states that all and each of which the aforesaid deputies, in behalf of themselves and their constituents, do claim, demand, and insist on as their indubitable rights and liberties, which cannot be legally taken from them, altered, or abridged by any power whatever, without their own consent, by their representatives in their several provincial legislators. In the course of our inquiry, we find many infringements and violations of the foregoing rights, which, from an ardent desire that harmony and mutual intercourse of affection and interest may be restored, we pass over for the present and proceed to state such acts and measures have been adopted since the last war, which demonstrate a system formed to enslave America. In the text, the patriots establish property as an unalienable right, of which every human is entitled to and should not be stripped of regardless of circumstance. The colonists argued that if the sole purpose of a government was to protect the rights of the people, then in denying of these liberties, the system implodes. Thus, if the government is inadequate in securing their rights, then, the patriots argued, independence is imperative. Continuing on, the patriots argued that a distant government, such as Great Britain, were unfit to rule over the colonies who lived thousands of miles away. In January 10, 1776, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, the author supplies that small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care, but there is something absurd in something a continent could be to be perpetually governed by an island. In essence, this means that it is within reason for a kingdom to protect a small and distant island, but to state that it is appropriate for a small kingdom to maintain governance over a sizable colony is, in every regard, illogical. It is rational for a natural order to be imposed between a small island and sizable kingdom, but not over the inverse. Hence, the patriots supplied many arguments in favor of declaring independence within the years of 1774 through 1776, of which laid the foundation for eventual succession and secession and subsequent freedom from colonial governance. Particularly notable among these were the beliefs that the rights of the colonies were being abridged through taxation without representation, the levying of taxes upon the colonies without representing them in government, and that a distant government such as Great Britain was unfit to rule the colonies.
Between the years of 1774 and 1776, the arguments written by loyalists in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings that opposed declaring independence contended that, in claiming independence from Great Britain, the American colonies would become vulnerable without the protection of the former. In overruling the monarchy set forth by the British, as was a popular loyalist belief in embracing democracy, the colonies would fall into ruin. They were, in essence, seeking to convey that Great Britain intended to regulate the colonies and prevent chaos rather than oppress their inhabitants. To begin, without the protection of their mother country, Great Britain, it was the widespread belief amongst Tories, otherwise called loyalists, that the colonists would fall into a state of vulnerability. In arguments against the dependence of these colonies by John Dickinson, it is remarked that to escape from the protection we have in British rule by declaring independence would be like destroying a house before we have got another in winter with a small family and then asking a neighbor to take us in and finding he is entirely unprepared. This is reflective of the loyalist consensus that without the protection of the British Empire, perhaps the most formidable empire of its time, it was irrefutable that the colonies would fall into ruin and lose the ability to sustain themselves. In a different account, March 1776, Plain Truth by James Chalmers, otherwise called Candidus, a response to common sense, it is stated that, but to the abhorrence of independency, which if effected would inevitably plunge our once preeminently country into ruin, horror, and desolation. Moreover, in Novanglus, John Adams, in Massachusetts, Daniel Leonard, the latter argues that the security of the people from internal rapacity and violence and from foreign invasion is the end and design of the government. A government formed upon these three principles in due proportion is the best calculated to answer the ends of government and to endure. All of the mentioned accounts are appeals to practicality, depicting Great Britain as a dominating force designed to protect the colonists rather than oppress them and strip them of their inherent, natural-born rights. While it is the general belief of the colonists that if Great Britain, often referred to as the colonist, mother country, were to be a parent, they would have been austere and brutal, creating a life of struggle for their metaphorical children, the colonies. Instead, the loyalists put forth the idea that the aforementioned country, while perhaps strict in some regards, would have acted in such a manner as to protect their child from harm. Furthermore, many loyalists believed that in overruling the monarchy set forth by the British and embracing democracy, the colonies would fall into ruin. This idea can be seen in the document, March 1776, Plain Truth by James Chalmers, Candidus, in a response to common sense, which regards democracy as entirely impractical. There never existed, nor ever will exist, a real democracy in the world. That a democracy supposes the concurrence of a number of circumstances rarely united. In the first place, it is requisite that the state itself should be of small extent, so that the people may be easily assembled and personally known to each other. Secondly, the simplicity of their manners should be such as to prevent a multiplicity of affairs and perplexity in discussing them. And thirdly, there should subsist a great degree of equality between them in point of right and authority. Lastly, there should be little or no luxury, for luxury must be either the effect of wealth or it must make it necessary. It corrupts at once both rich and poor, the one by the possession and the other by the want of it. This account proposes that democracy is an entirely chaotic idea and can only be made possible by nearly unattainable circumstances. It responds to a common critique of the British monarchy, being that it is tyrannical and wont to produce dictators, by appealing to its practicality. Thus, between the years of 1774 to 1776, the arguments written by the Loyalists in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings that opposed declaring independence argue that the colonies would lose their former prosperity and perhaps fallen to ruin. They contended that by declaring independence from Great Britain, the colonies would lose the backing of the British Empire, perhaps the most formidable empire of its time, and that by overruling the democracy set forth by the British and embracing democracy, the colonies would fall into ruin. I will now pass the floor to my co-counsel, Sarong Kim, who will discuss the seventh inquiry.
Continuing on, the seventh inquiry states, discuss the Continental Congress's efforts of reconciliation with Great Britain in 1775. The Continental Congress's efforts of reconciliation with Great Britain in 1775 included the Olive Branch Petition, a peace agreement forwarded to the aforementioned country by the colonists. The hope at reconciliation on the part of the Continental Congress were reflected in this document, being to restore the former prosperity of the bond between the colonies and Great Britain, and the mother country to acknowledge the rights and the grievances imparted on them. To begin, in writing the Olive Branch Petition, the colonies hoped to restore the former prosperity that was a product of their bond with Great Britain. The document, at large, conveyed that before the taxations and regulations were imposed on the colonies, the bond between the pair was fruitful and could not be subject to criticism. The document on July 8, 1775, Olive Branch Petition from the Continental Congress to the King denotes a marked contrast between the condition of the colonies before and after the severities inflicted upon them in the quote, the union between our mother country and these colonies, and the energy of mild and just government produced benefits so remarkably important and afforded such an assurance of their permanency and increase, that the wonder and envy of other nations were excited, while they beheld Great Britain rising to a power the most extraordinary the world had ever been known. Her rivals observing that there was no probability of this happy connection being broken by civil dissensions, and apprehending its future effects, if left any longer undisturbed, resolved to prevent her receiving such continual and formidable accessions of wealth and strength, by checking the growth of these settlements from which they were to be derived. In this text, the Continental Congress argues that if their connection was left unperturbed by the intervention of Great Britain, their bond would have been fruitful. And so, in listing this argument, the Continental Congress hoped to restore the former prosperity by stating the way in which it was attained, an object that could only be attained by the way of appealing the taxations and regulations imposed on the colonies. Continuing on, the belief that the reconciliation was beyond reason in the year 1775 was not yet adopted by the majority of the colonists. In the document March 22nd, 1775, speech of Edmund Burke on moving his resolution for conciliation with the colonies, the author ascribed a favored opinion at the time. As long as you have the wisdom to keep the sovereign authority of this country as the sanctuary of liberty, the sacred temple consecrated to our common faith, whether the chosen race and sons of English worship freedom, they will turn their faces towards you. This sentiment is largely reflective on the intent of the Olive Branch Petition and the ideas that the attainment and subsequent solidification of their rights who would wholly serve to dismiss the notions of independence embraced at the time. In short, reaching reconciliation without forfeiting their liberties was the wish of many colonists and members of the Continental Congress. Hence, the Continental Congress attempted to reconcile with Great Britain in 1775 by the way of issuing the Olive Branch Petition. This document reflected the hopes of the Continental Congress, largely on behalf of the colonists, to restore the former prosperity between the colonies and that was a product of the nil taxations and or regulations, and to attain their mother country's acknowledgement of grievances and inherent rights.
We will now address the eighth inquiry, being discuss the deliberations of the Continental Congress in June and July of 1776 that led to declaring independence. The deliberations of the Continental Congress in June and July that led to the colonies declaring independence, including passed a resolution including the Declaration of Independence and approving its subsequent publication, an argument entailing America's formal secession from Great Britain. Their meditations ultimately produced the said document, the contents of which included many various grievances expressed by them on behalf of the colonies. To begin, the Continental Congress was responsible for the creation of the Declaration of Independence, one of America's founding documents, also laid down the foundation for such a dramatic move to be made. Preceding this event, on June 7, 1776, the Lee Resolution, introduced by Richard Henry Lee, expressly drafted into words the sentiments of the patriots of the time. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. A predecessor to the Declaration of Independence, and later subscribed into its final draft, it expressed the same feelings as the aforementioned document. As the musings of the Continental Congress progressed, so too did their intrepidness or braveness. From a few patriotic ruminations was brought forth a comprehensive document entailing the grievances of the British government. Written on July 4, 1776, in the Journal of the Continental Congress, and eventually published into the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, were the words, "In every stage of the oppressions we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a people who mean to be free. It serves as a lamentation, grieving the desolation faced by the colonies under the face of tyranny. The Continental Congress created the image that had the rightful criticisms of the colonies had been addressed, such a forceful departure from Britain would have not been a necessity." This sentiment is furthermore present throughout other fragments of the document. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations begun at a distinguished period, and pursuing invariably the same subject evinces a design to reduce them under absolute power, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government, and to provide these new guards for their future security. These aforementioned sentences, when viewed in singularity, reflect Great Britain's improper management of their subsidiaries. Hence, the deliberations of the Continental Congress in June and July that led to the colonies declaring independence, including passing a resolution including in the subsequent formal adoption of the Declaration of Independence. This document revolutionized patriotic beliefs in that it compacted the patriotic sentiments of the time into an official document declaring America as an autonomous nation.
On regards to the ninth inquiry, discuss how the text of the Declaration of Independence changed throughout different drafts in June and July of 1776. The text of the Declaration of Independence changed throughout the various drafts made of it throughout June and July of 1776. This can especially be seen when comparing Jefferson's first drafts and last draft, the former of which possessed a distinctive emotional tone, contrary to the latter, which makes an effort to remain to a certain extent, or at least come off as, objective. The first draft specifically states that by endeavoring to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions of existence. By transporting at this time a large army of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with the circumstances of cruelty, perfidy, so unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Jefferson's first draft does not make a sufficient argument or establish our unalienable rights, perhaps the most well-known part of the Declaration of Independence in modern day, but rather simply lists the grievances of the colonists. The draft held lots of emotion and subsequently read as a rant rather than an official declaration of sovereignty. Over time, Jefferson's writing quality improves as the text matures, as can be seen in the switch in word usage, going from emotional to formal. Jefferson's original rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, June and July 1776, displays immense growth, stating, "He has refused to assent the laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has neglected utterly to attend to them." Contrary to the composition draft, Jefferson addresses the colonists' issues formally, which is a major change to the first draft. This helped to improve the feelings of legitimacy surrounding the Declaration of Independence and demonstrate to Great Britain the colonies were formidable.
The Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson in June of 1776, was less born of spontaneity and more a mosaic of the rights and liberties that were, under commonplace belief, inherent at the time of the document's creation. Perhaps most influential in its creation were John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, the Bill of Rights, a list of grievances, all of which contributed to the broader political climate and provided direct frameworks, whether they be philosophical, political, or beneficial in some other means, to the final draft. To begin, John Locke's Second Treatise of Government outlines the principle of the consent of the governed. It states that men, being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. This quote reflects the idea that the foundation of a government is its people, and that it is imperative that it be based upon the approval of the people being governed, rather than a divine right or force. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, on behalf of the colonies, declares that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, a mere image of the proposition first laid down by John Locke. Continuing on, Thomas Paine's Common Sense significantly impacted the Declaration of Independence. The principle that a government should be founded on the will of the people was not an unforeseen standard at the time of the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine established that we have had every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. This quote gives the power to the people, the noble servants and fundaments of the nation, as opposed to the body or figure at the head of it. The sentence is, "It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, government, and to institute new government," directly aligns with the wording of common sense and thus denotes the work's obvious influence on our nation's founding document. Moving forward, the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, the Bill of Rights, a list of grievances, outlines the unalienable rights, or otherwise the rights that every human is entitled to, an essential principle of the Declaration that it bases a magnanimous portion of itself on, and declares similar wording to the final draft. It states that they are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and they have never ceded to any sovereign power whatever a right to dispose of either without their consent. This text directly mirrors the assertion, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness," and is thus demonstrative of the fact that the Declaration of Independence was heavily influenced by the aforementioned document. Thus, the Declaration of Independence was heavily influenced by various speeches and pamphlets of the time that it was first established among the tenets of American patriotism. Particularly notable among its influences were the document John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, Common Sense by Tom Paine, and Declaration of Resolves of the First Continental Congress, which contributed substantially to the final draft.